The metallic click of the key turning in the lock echoed down the empty corridor. Grace Miller pushed the door open, expecting the familiar warmth of home after her long, exhausting crop scouting trip to Oregon. Instead, the heavy, suffocating scent of a premium amber noir perfume hit her face, a sharp, expensive fragrance she recognized instantly as Chloe Vance's signature scent. The penthouse was dead silent, but the air felt thick, charged, and wrong. On the polished mahogany dining table sat a half-eaten custom lemon meringue cake, her own signature recipe, hacked apart with brutal carelessness. Then, the silence shattered. From the master bedroom came the unmistakable sound of muffled, intimate laughter, followed by her husband Austin's low, hushed voice telling someone to quiet down. Her heart did not race. It slowed down, freezing into a cold, heavy stone as her eyes locked onto the half-open bedroom door. To understand how Grace's life unraveled into this single devastating second, we must look back at the quiet years before the storm. For the past 5 years, Grace had lived as a ghost in her own marriage. She was the head pastry chef and founder of the Flour and Grace, an artisanal bakery in downtown Chicago that she built with her own sweat, tears, and sleepless nights. Yet, as Austin's career at a New York real estate investment fund began to skyrocket, her world shrank. She gradually let him take control of their joint finances, trusting his professional expertise blindly. At home, she became the ultimate supportive wife, working 14-hour days at the bakery only to rush home and ensure his shirts were perfectly pressed, his favorite meals were hot, and his life was entirely seamless. But Austin's success brought a freezing temperature into the penthouse. Whenever he faced market pressure, or whenever they had a minor disagreement, he did not raise his voice. He used the silent treatment as a weapon of emotional abuse. He would look right through Grace for days, sometimes weeks, treating her like an unwanted piece of furniture. The silence in the house during those weeks was deafening, a heavy pressure that made her ears ring. To break the freeze, Grace would bake. She spent late nights in the kitchen, surrounded by the hum of the ovens, the sweet smell of vanilla bean, and the dust of powdered flour, crafting complex pastries just to win back a single smile or a brief nod of acknowledgement from her husband. She poured all her love into the food, hoping the warmth of her baking could thaw the ice in his heart. In doing so, she slowly erased her own identity, becoming completely invisible beneath the shadow of his growing ambition. Now, standing in the cold hallway, the illusion was gone. Her eyes took in the visual evidence of her own erasure. She walked past the ruined cake on the table, her steps light and noiseless on the hardwood floor. She approached the bedroom door and pushed it wide open. The scene inside was sharp and painful. Austin stood by the bed, his silk tie undone, his face draining of color as he gasped her name. Beside him, Chloe, the freelance PR specialist who Grace had welcomed into their home, fed with her own hands and treated like a sister, desperately pulled the satin sheets over her shoulders. The air in the room was choked with the smell of guilt and that heavy, cloying perfume. Austin stumbled forward, his hands trembling as he reached out, his voice cracking as he tried to initiate his usual deflection. "Grace, wait. It is not what it looks like. Let me explain," he pleaded, his eyes begging for the usual compliance she always offered. Grace did not scream. She did not shed a single tear. The years of enduring his freezing silences had inadvertently given her an armor of absolute calm. She simply looked at the two people she had loved and trusted most, seeing them clearly for the very first time. Every sacrifice she had made, every late-night recipe she had perfected, and every silent insult she had swallowed washed over her, turning her grief into pure, unyielding steel. She stepped back before his fingers could touch her coat. Turning her back on the chaos, she walked straight into the home office. Her movements were precise, efficient, and entirely deliberate. She did not pack a suitcase. She did not grab her clothes. Instead, She reached into the desk drawer and took out the two things that held the true value of her future: her original leather-bound book of proprietary baking formulas, her intellectual property, and the commercial banking card registered solely under her bakery's name. She slipped them into her trench coat pocket. Walking back to the front door, she ignored Austin's desperate shouts echoing down the hallway. She stepped out, pulled the heavy door shut, and turned the key, locking the Betrayal inside. The cabin of the overnight flight to Paris was bathed in a dim, sterile blue light. Grace sat rigid in her seat, staring blankly at the dark window. The steady, low hum of the jet engines vibrated through the floorboards, a constant rumble that drowned out the noise in her head. Down in the cabin sink, her phone lay submerged in a plastic cup of stale water. Before she dropped it in, the screen had flashed white, buzzing relentlessly with frantic notifications from Austin and Chloe. Now it was black and dead. She breathed in the dry, recycled airplane air, tasting the faint tint of plastic and cold coffee. In her trench coat pocket, the sharp corner of her leather-bound recipe book pressed against her ribs, a solid, comforting weight. She had spent years declining the French Culinary Institute's prestigious 3-year master fellowship because she refused to leave Austin alone in Chicago. Tonight, that sacrifice felt like a joke. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. Dawn in Paris arrived with the smell of damp cobblestones and roasting espresso beans. Grace stood on the pavement of the 11th arrondissement, her eyes burning from sleep deprivation. She did not allow herself to cry. Instead, she sat at a small metal table in a corner cafe and opened her laptop. Her first phone call was not to family, but to an international corporate attorney. Within 3 hours, the legal gears were turning. She authorized a complete audit of the Flour and Grace. Her lawyer filed emergency motions in the Cook County Court to freeze the bakery's business accounts and separate her intellectual property from Austin's investment portfolio. She watched the digital signatures finalize on her screen with a cold sense of satisfaction. Her brand was hers alone. Weeks blended into a blur of intense labor. The Institute's kitchens were loud, hot, and blindingly bright. Grace immersed herself in the sharp hiss of steaming ovens, the rhythmic clatter of metal whisks against copper bowls, and the rich, bittersweet aroma of melting dark chocolate. It was during an international symposium on sustainable food supply chains that she met Logan Carter. He was presenting a lecture on global grain logistics. Logan was tall, carried himself with quiet authority, and spoke with a calm, measured cadence. When they spoke afterward, his eyes did not hold the pity she usually saw from people who knew her story. He looked at her handwritten formulas, noted her precise calculations on flour hydration, and spoke to her as an equal. He saw a brilliant culinary strategist, not a broken woman. One evening, a fierce autumn rain lashed against the glass of her small rented apartment. Grace stood by the window, watching the distant golden lights of the Eiffel Tower blur through the wet pane. She opened a crisp, new notebook. The pages smelled of clean paper and fresh ink. She wrote a single sentence on the first page: "My happiness no longer depends on the temperature of another person's room." The heavy knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for 5 years finally loosened. She walked to the bed, pulled up the thick duvet, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, completely untethered from the past. The next 2 years in Paris became a relentless symphony of heat, sweat, and deliberate transformation. Grace rose every morning at 4. The cobblestones outside her window were always slick with gray dawn mist, smelling of damp earth and cold river water. She no longer allowed herself to wander down the dark alleys of memory. Whenever the phantom pain of Austin's freezing silences crept into her chest, she shut her eyes, took a deep breath, and forced her hands to move. Action was her only sanctuary. She buried her grief under the weight of heavy copper pots, the sharp clatter of steel scales, and the blinding white dust of unbleached flour. Her routine was rigid and unforgiving. She spent the first half of her days at the Institute, mastering the chemistry of food. She learned how protein networks formed in dough, how temperature altered sugar crystallization, and how to control the volatile oils in natural yeast. Her world was no longer guided by emotional guesswork. It was governed by logic, precision, and numbers. In the afternoons, she did not rest. She sat in the crowded university libraries, studying financial accounting, culinary asset management, and international franchise law. She was no longer just a woman who knew how to bake sweet things. She was transforming into a strategist who understood how to build a global empire. Her physical appearance altered along with her mind. One crisp autumn morning, she walked into a salon on the Rue de Rivoli and asked the stylist to cut away her past. The long, soft hair that Austin had once preferred fell to the floor in heavy, dark heaps. In its place was a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed her face with clean, geometric lines. She looked into the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. Her eyes were no longer wide with the anxious desire to please. They were narrow, focused, and steady. She traded her oversized, faded aprons and soft linen shirts for structured, charcoal gray chef coats and tailored blazers. Every garment she wore felt like a piece of armor, shielding her from the vulnerabilities of her old life. Her collaboration with Logan Carter provided a steady, grounding rhythm to her frantic pace. Logan did not crowd her space, nor did he offer empty, sentimental praise. He brought his vast knowledge of logistics into her culinary world. Together, they spent late nights transforming her old, chaotic recipe blog into a sleek, institutional multimedia platform. The room would smell of strong black coffee and the sharp, ozone scent of a hot laptop battery. Logan sat across the table, his fingers moving efficiently over spreadsheets, analyzing user data, and mapping out supply chains for artisanal grains. Logan understood boundaries, the strict lines she had drawn around her heart. He never tried to push past them. One rainy night, after Grace had spent 12 consecutive hours developing a vegan lamination process for pastry dough, her hands began to tremble with exhaustion. She refused to stop, her teeth grit, as she forced the rolling pin against the cold butter block. Logan did not grab the pin from her hands. He did not pity her. He simply walked to the stove, heated a bowl of rustic lentil soup, and set it gently near her station. On a small yellow sticky note beside the bowl, he wrote in his clean, architectural handwriting, "I respect your drive, but your body deserves your respect too." Grace stared at the note. The words did not feel like a demand or an emotional transaction. They felt like a mirror showing her own worth. She put down the rolling pin and ate the warm soup in quiet gratitude. Through these deliberate actions, her mindset shifted completely. The image of Austin and Chloe in the penthouse faded from a burning, wound into a historical fact. She stopped asking, "Why did they do this to me?" She stopped waiting for a cosmic apology that would never come. She realized that their betrayal, though brutal, had broken the golden cage that kept her invisible. She was no longer the victim of an unfaithful husband. She was the sole author of her next chapter. The platform grew exponentially, drawing the attention of major international culinary conglomerates. The digital metrics were undeniable. Millions of monthly views, a dedicated global subscriber base, and absolute authority in the niche of artisanal pastry innovation. One bright spring afternoon, the fax machine in the Institute's office whirred to life, spitting out a heavy bonded paper document. It was a formal executive offer from the largest F&B conglomerate in New York City. They wanted Grace Miller to take the position of global creative director and strategic shareholder, tasking her with the complete revitalization of their struggling luxury bakery chain across the East Coast. Grace stood in the courtyard of the Institute, holding the thick document in her hands. The air smelled of blooming chestnut trees and fresh rain. Logan walked up beside her, his hands tucked quietly into the pockets of his trench coat. He looked at the paper, then looked at her face. "It is a massive stage," he said, his voice low and steady. Grace turned the page, her thumb pressing into the raised gold seal of the corporate logo. She did not feel fear. She felt a cold, sharp readiness vibrating through her veins. She looked at Logan, her eyes bright beneath her sharp bangs. "It is my stage," she replied quietly. "It is time to go back to New York." The grand ballroom of the Mandarin Oriental in Manhattan was a sea of glittering glass, expensive velvet, and heavy gold plating. The air inside smelled of roasted prime rib, aged champagne, and the sharp metallic tang of burning candle wax. Clinking crystal glasses and the low, collective hum of hundreds of wealthy investors created a dense wall of sound. Tonight was the high-profile launch party for the East Coast luxury bakery franchise revitalization, backed by New York's largest F&B conglomerate. A sleek, midnight black town car pulled up to the red carpet outside. The door opened, and Grace Miller stepped out into the crisp, biting New York air. The blinding white flashes of press cameras erupted instantly, reflecting off the sharp, clean lines of her tailored charcoal suit jacket. Her asymmetrical bob cut was perfect, framing a face that was calm, smooth, and entirely unbothered. She walked into the ballroom with absolute poise, her high heels tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. Beside her walked Logan Carter, his tall frame clad in a simple, elegant tuxedo, his presence quiet and grounded. Grace was no longer the invisible shadow hiding in a Chicago kitchen. She was the star of the night, the newly appointed global creative director and strategic shareholder. Across the room, standing near the mahogany bar, Austin Miller froze. His fingers tightened around his glass of scotch until his knuckles turned white. The past 3 years had not been kind to his business. The sudden freezing of the bakery assets years ago, combined with a sharp downturn in the mid-tier real estate market, had left his investment fund bleeding cash. He looked older, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his shoulders, his face marked by exhaustion. Seeing Grace now, radiant, powerful, and surrounded by a circle of top-tier executives, struck him like a physical blow. She was completely transformed. Austin abandoned his conversation and walked straight through the crowd, his breathing heavy as he approached the VIP lounge. Logan noticed him first, stepping slightly to the side to give Grace space, his expression calm but vigilant. "Grace," Austin gasped, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the noisy room. He stepped directly into her path, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, desperation, and sudden, intense regret. "You came back. I've spent 3 years looking for you. I went to every culinary school registry. I called everyone. You just vanished." Grace stopped. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his face. Her expression did not change. There was no sudden rush of anger, no tremor of fear, and no lingering sadness. To her, the man standing in front of her was simply a stranger from an old, closed book. "Austin," she said, her voice dropping into a low, perfectly steady register that cut right through his panic. "Please just give me 5 minutes to explain." Austin pleaded, his hands reaching out automatically, trying to initiate the old dynamic, trying to break her calm. "The night you left, it was a trap. Chloe set it up. She manipulated everything. I lost my mind because the market was crashing, and you were away for months. I made the biggest mistake of my life, but I never stopped loving you. I need you to understand." A faint, cool smile touched Grace's lips, but it did not reach her eyes. "Austin, look at me," she said quietly. "You keep talking about explanations, as if I am still waiting for one. You did not make a mistake. You made a series of conscious choices, and I made mine. Grace, please. You did not lose me, Austin, she interrupted, her tone sharp and precise like a chef's knife. Let me make this clear in a language your fund understands. I simply chose to fire a low-performance asset from my life. You are no longer important enough to be my reason for anything. From this point on, any communication regarding our shared history or corporate investments will go strictly through my legal team. Austin stepped back, his face draining of all color, his mouth opening but finding no words. The absolute finality in her voice crushed his remaining illusions. A few feet away, hidden behind a large floral arrangement of white orchids, Chloe Vance watched the entire exchange. She was dressed in a tight, emerald green gown, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure envy. The Team Bond copycat she had opened in Chicago using Grace's old concepts was failing, her reputation in the PR world was crumbling, and Austin had cut off her financial support long ago. Seeing Grace stand on the pinnacle of success while she stood in the shadows burned her chest. Chloe gripped her silver clutch bag tightly, her eyes narrowing as a malicious plan began to take shape in her mind. Grace thought she had won, but Chloe was determined to drag her down into the mud once and for all. The morning sun did not break through the thick, charcoal-gray clouds hanging over Manhattan. Inside the executive boardroom of the F&B conglomerate, the air was cold, smelling of stale paper and bitter, burnt coffee. Grace Miller sat at the long glass table, her face cast in shadow. Across from her, 3 corporate attorneys stared at their glowing laptop screens. The silence in the room was heavy, punctured only by the frantic, rhythmic tapping of computer keys. Just 48 hours before the official grand opening of her luxury bakery chain, Chloe Vance struck from the dark. Working alongside a disgruntled ex-manager whom Grace had fired for incompetence months prior, Chloe had launched a coordinated legal and media assault. They filed a formal lawsuit in the New York State Supreme Court and lodged a complaint with the National F&B Trade Council. The charge was severe: corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and breach of trade secrets. Chloe presented digital copies of handwritten recipes and early design sketches, claiming Grace had stolen the proprietary framework from Chloe's own Chicago-based bakery enterprise. The internet exploded with the news. Tabloid headlines flashed across smartphone screens in bright red text: plagiarism or pastry, the dark secret behind New York's newest culinary star. The conglomerate's board of directors was panicking. The multimillion-dollar project faced an immediate court-ordered freeze if a preliminary injunction was granted. Everything Grace had built over the last 3 years was standing on the edge of a cliff. Grace did not call a public relations firm. She did not draft an emotional statement for social media. She sat perfectly still, her spine straight against the leather chair, her sharp bob hair framing eyes that looked like black obsidian. She turned to Logan Carter, who sat to her right, his large hand resting near a stack of thick legal folders. "Open the vault," Grace said, her voice dropping into a quiet, icy whisper that commanded absolute attention. She did not rely on memories or promises. She relied on empirical evidence. Grace reached into her bag and placed the old, weathered leather-bound notebook onto the center of the glass table. The scent of dried flour dust and old paper faintly drifted into the air. She opened the first page, revealing her precise culinary formulas written in faded blue ink. But the critical defense was not just the ink, it was the digital security protocol she had established years ago. Before she ever boarded the flight to Paris, Grace had worked with a tech-focused copyright attorney in Chicago. Every single recipe, every ingredient ratio, and every specific lamination technique in that book had been assigned a time-stamped, encrypted digital watermark and registered with the United States Copyright Office. She pushed a flash drive across the table to her legal team. It contained the original federal certificate numbers from 4 years prior, long before Chloe ever opened her copycat bakery, and long before Grace's marriage to Austin had collapsed. The timeline was flawless. The logic was bulletproof. Meanwhile, across the city in a dimly lit hotel bar, Chloe Vance met with Austin Miller. The room smelled of spilled alcohol and heavy cigar smoke. Chloe slid a document across the sticky table, her eyes glittering with predatory triumph. "Sign this, Austin," Chloe hissed, her voice sharp and eager. "Use your fund's leverage as a minority stakeholder to withdraw all capital from Grace's project. We can crush her tonight, and your firm can reinvest in my brand." Austin looked down at the paper. He looked at Chloe's face, seeing the raw, ugly malice twisting her features. Then, he looked at his own reflection in the dark amber liquid of his glass. For 3 years, he had lived with the suffocating weight of his own regret. He remembered the freezing silence he used to inflict on Grace, the way he had dismissed her worth, and the utter dignity with which she had walked away from him. He realized that his apology at the ballroom meant nothing if he continued to let his past choices destroy her present. He looked at the woman who had helped him betray his wife, and a wave of profound disgust washed over him. "No," Austin said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who had finally decided to break his own cycle of cowardice. Austin stood up, leaving the document unsigned on the table. He walked out of the bar and straight to the office of Grace's lead attorney. He did not ask to see Grace. He knew he did not deserve her audience. Instead, he handed over a secure digital drive from his corporate server. The drive contained the ultimate piece of forensic evidence, complete, unedited camera logs from their old Chicago penthouse apartment from 3 years ago. The footage explicitly captured Chloe Vance entering Grace's private home office, hacking into her personal computer, and downloading the proprietary files while Grace was away on her research trip. Furthermore, Austin provided financial wire transfers proving Chloe had used Austin's corporate funds under false pretenses to pay off the disgruntled manager. Austin knew this disclosure would destroy his own investment fund's reputation and invite severe regulatory scrutiny. He was willingly setting fire to his own career, but it was the only real currency he had left to pay his moral debt. Armed with federal copyright registrations and Austin's devastating forensic evidence, Grace's legal team struck back with surgical precision. They did not wait for the court hearing. They filed a massive countersuit for civil conspiracy, perjury, and commercial fraud, immediately submitting the evidence to the New York State prosecutor. The reversal was absolute and instantaneous. The state prosecutor reviewed the digital evidence and immediately denied Chloe's injunction. By noon the next day, the red headlines changed. Luxury bakery vindicated. Landmark fraud exposed. The conglomerate's board ratified Grace's absolute authority over the franchise, and the grand opening was cleared for launch. 2 detectives from the NYPD white-collar crime unit walked into Chloe Vance's boutique office in Midtown. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the glass room. Chloe screamed, her manicured nails clawing at the desk as she was led out in front of flashing news cameras, facing multiple felony charges of grand larceny and industrial espionage. In her office at the flagship bakery, Grace received a text message from her attorney outlining the details of Chloe's arrest and Austin's legal surrender. The air around her smelled of fresh yeast, sweet vanilla, and warm sugar from the test ovens below. She read the message once. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She simply closed the laptop screen, slid the old leather notebook back into her drawer, and locked it. The storm had passed, leaving the foundation of her empire completely unshaken. The frantic roar of Manhattan traffic outside felt distant, muted by the thick glass windows of the newly opened flagship bakery. Inside, the grand opening celebration had finally wound down. The heavy scent of sugar glass, roasted pecans, and fresh espresso still hung thick and warm in the air. The bright, sharp camera flashes had ceased. The jazz quartet had packed away their brass instruments, leaving a profound, comfortable silence in the space. Grace Miller stood near the marble counter, surrounded by large, towering bouquets of white lilies and orchids sent by corporate partners. She wore her chef's coat, the white fabric crisp and clean. Her hands, dusted with a faint trace of powdered flour, were relaxed at her sides. The frantic rush of the past few days was over. The kitchen was clean. The display cases were empty, completely cleared out by a record-breaking crowd of eager customers. Logan Carter walked out from the back office, his footsteps making a soft, rhythmic thud against the polished concrete floor. He had traded his formal suit jacket for a simple black vest, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He did not rush toward her. He did not carry a velvet box or a grand, dramatic declaration of love. Instead, he placed a large, heavy box made of dark, oiled walnut wood on the marble table between them. Next to it, he laid a neat, 2-page document printed on heavy, cream-colored linen paper. "The opening was a triumph, Grace," Logan said, his voice dropping into a low, steady rumble that filled the quiet room. He tapped the edge of the paper with his finger. "But before the business day officially ends, I need to submit a proposal for a long-term contract." Grace looked down at the header of the document. Written in crisp, architectural print were the words, "Long-term partnership and mutual growth agreement." A genuine, soft smile touched her lips as her eyes scanned the lines. It was a perfectly structured, legal framework for a shared life, written with the humor and intellect of a true strategist. The first clause was clear. Logan Carter agrees to manage all logistical supply chains, ensuring the absolute security of ingredients and total creative autonomy for Grace Miller. There would be no shared bank accounts designed to control, and no hidden financial leverage. Her business belonged entirely to her. The second clause struck a deeper chord. Both parties agreed to a strict policy of zero communication freezes. The use of silent treatment as a tool of negotiation is permanently banned. All operational disputes must be resolved through open, transparent dialogue within 24 hours. Logan knew the phantom pains of her past marriage, and he had built an ironclad boundary against cold violence. The third clause read, "Logan Carter requests the permanent right to be the primary tester of all new pastry formulations and the privilege to stand beside Grace Miller as a partner of equal status." Grace looked up from the linen paper. The warm evening light cut through the window, casting a long, golden shadow across Logan's face. For years, she had been forced to read between the lines of Austin's cold silences, guessing his moods, shrinking herself to fit his ego. Logan was the exact opposite. He did not want a shadow. He wanted a partner. He laid his cards flat on the table, offering total clarity, absolute respect, and a love that asked for permission rather than assuming ownership. "I have monitored the trial period closely," Logan said quietly, his eyes steady and warm. "I know your coffee order by heart. I know you ignore lunch when a deadline approaches. I love the empire you built, Grace. But more than that, I love the woman who refused to let her past dictate her worth. I am submitting my application to stay beside you. Not for a season, but for good." Grace let out a soft laugh, a sound that carried the weight of 3 years of hard, solitary healing. A few tears, warm and clear, slid down her cheeks, but they were not born of grief. She picked up a sleek black pen from the counter, signed her name firmly at the bottom of the linen page, and slid it back across the marble. She did not wait for him to step forward. Grace stepped across the small distance between them, reached out, and firmly slipped her hand into his. Logan's grip was warm, solid, and certain. He held her close under the fading amber light of the New York sky, sealing a partnership built not on dependency, but on the unbreakable foundation of mutual respect and absolute freedom. The late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the expansive organic valley farm in upstate New York in a warm, amber glow. The air smelled of damp earth, sweet clover, and the crisp, sharp scent of ripening apples from the nearby orchards. A gentle breeze swept through the fields, rustling the tall green stalks of heirloom wheat with a soft, rhythmic hiss. Grace Miller stood on the wide wooden porch of the farmhouse, looking out over the land she and Logan had built together. Her physical appearance reflected this new chapter of her life. Her sharp bob haircut caught the golden light, and her skin looked radiant, clear of the drawn exhaustion of her past. She wore a simple, comfortable linen shirt and boots caked with rich soil. She was no longer running, and she was no longer hiding. Standing in this peaceful expanse, a profound mindset shift filled her entire being. She looked back at her journey not with pain, but with absolute clarity. The bitter memory of Austin's freezing silences and Chloe's sharp betrayal no longer carried any emotional weight. They were no longer villains in her story. They were simply old catalysts that had forced her to break her own chains. She had completely stopped playing the victim. She no longer blamed the past for her wounds. She stood there, breathing in the clean air, fully in control of her own joy, her own finance, and her own destiny. Logan stepped out onto the porch, his boots thudding softly against the cedar wood. He handed her a steaming mug of hot apple cider, the sweet, spiced aroma of cinnamon and clove rising into the cool air. He did not say a word. He simply stood beside her, his shoulder lightly brushing hers, matching her stride as they watched the sky turn from deep orange to a soft lavender purple. Their partnership was a two-way street, a beautifully balanced machine of equal financial equity, shared labor, and absolute mutual respect. From the kitchen counter inside, a small white envelope caught the light. It was a short, handwritten note from Austin Miller, delivered earlier that week. His investment fund had survived the legal storm, but his influence in New York was gone. The note was brief. Grace, the new chain of stores is beautiful. I finally understand that some things cannot be fixed with a late apology. Thank you for forcing me to face my own reflection. I wish you the true peace I failed to give you. Take care, Austin. Grace had read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a storage box in the office. There was no surge of triumph. There was no lingering anger. There was only peace. She did not need his regret to feel vindicated. Her victory was entirely her own, built from raw grit, sleepless nights, and the courage to walk away from the place that broke her. She took a slow sip of the warm cider, feeling the heat spread through her chest. She looked at Logan, then looked back at the darkening fields. In the bakery, Grace said softly, her voice carrying a light, melodic rhythm in the quiet evening, "If a batch of dough fails because the environment is too cold, you do not waste your life trying to bake it anyway. You throw it out. You clean the station. You adjust the temperature, and you begin again with a better formula. Life is exactly the same." She turned to Logan, her eyes bright and entirely free. Leaving Austin was not the end of my story. It was the absolute beginning. I did not win because they lost. I won because I finally chose myself. Logan smiled, his fingers wrapping gently around her hand, waiting for her nod of consent before drawing her close. Together, they stood under the fading golden hour, completely liberated from the past, proud and untamed, stepping forward into a future that belonged entirely to them. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.